Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are so pleased to have you with us today. So, dear friends, colleagues, honored guests, welcome to the second day of Signal's 5th annual conference on Israel's China policy. Thanks to those of you who sent so many lovely comments and feedback on yesterday's proceedings. It was a wonderful start to this event, which is also commemorating Signal's 10th anniversary. In my opening remarks yesterday, I mentioned how different things were between China and Israel 10 years ago. There was no academic exchange, no courses on Israel studies in China at all. In fact, back then, Israel was not really seen in a positive light. In China, there was little information available on Israel except through the media, which only covered war and conflict. But all that started to change in 2011, just after China became the world's second largest economy and decided it would transform from the world's manufacturers to the world's innovators. That opened the door for warmer relations with Israel. Over the past decade, China-Israel relations have transformed from almost no contact at all to a vast array of intersecting interests in business and technology, of course, but also in culture and people-to-people interchange. Yesterday, we looked at the China-Israel relationship from a wide angle, through the lens of the deepening rivalry between the US and China, where we heard that China is seeking a recalibration in its relations with the US. The expert from China noted that Beijing is well aware of the close ties between America and Israel. He suggested that the formula be the US and Israel working with China, as opposed to US and Israel against China. The American speaker said that the potential for a recalibration with the new administration will very much depend on not only what China says, but what it does. In the second session, we moved to another wide-angle view of Israel's position in this great power rivalry, looking at the Indo-Pacific strategy, the formation of the Quad, Japan, US, Australia, and India, and the creation of the D10, a grouping of 10 democratic states, the G7 plus South Korea, India, and Australia. Those deliberations revealed a divergence of views, for example, on the efficacy of values-based policy versus interest-based policy. The discussions also clearly conveyed the consensus that China is a powerful player whose impact will continue to be felt throughout the region, and that America is paying closer attention than ever to how its friends and allies are dealing with this new dynamic. At day's end, we had the privilege of hosting the US Secretary for Near East Affairs, who gave the closing keynote remarks. He stressed that the US is not trying to suggest that Israel end its relations with China, that the US itself has no intention of doing so. But he was the first US official who noted on record that Israel should take care in deepening its high-tech ties with China, which sets the stage for today's proceedings, because as we narrow the focus, we will first zoom in more closely on Israel-China relations in the area of technology that will deal directly with this topic of China-Israel innovation and technology cooperation. From there, we'll move to the Middle East, looking at China's growing interest in the region. Where is this interest rooted, and how the region itself is welcoming this new major player? And finally, I am delighted to say that today's proceedings will conclude with an esteemed guest. We are honored to welcome China's former ambassador to Jordan and Qatar, Dr. Yue Xiaoyong, to give the closing keynote address of the day and of the conference. On a technical note, always have to deal with the logistics. I want to remind you that the event is webinar format, so you'll only see the speaker. Please submit your questions via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and write your name and country along with the question. Kindly note that the chat is disabled and this event is recorded and on record. Once again, the proceedings will be conducted as moderated discussions so that we'll be able to hold a series of engaging debates within the limited time frame of a webinar. I want to thank the moderators and speakers in advance for agreeing to participate and giving their time, and thanks to all of you for joining. We look forward to these deliberations and to your questions and comments. So, without further ado, let's move on to the first session of the conference, the China-Israel Innovation Partnership, Looming Clouds or Bright Future. I'm delighted to turn over the mic to the moderator of this session, Ron Friedman, Managing Editor of CTEC by the Calcalist. Ron, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carrie. Sorry, I had to unmute there, of course. Can't do without these technical issues. But like you said, the session, the focus of this session primary drivers of China-Israel relations over the last decade, and primarily innovation and high-tech technology. We're joined in this panel by Mr. Hagai Shagrir. He's the Deputy Head, Asia and Pacific Branch of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Also by Mr. Dorian Barak. He's the founder and managing director of Indigo Global, and he's the co-founder of the UAE Israel Business Council. And Dr. Zhao Hai, he's a research fellow in the Institute of World Economics and Politics at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. I'm going to open a question up or address an issue, a topic that's relevant for everybody, and we'll field your answers or thoughts one by one. Like Carice mentioned, both Chinese and Israeli business leaders have expressed their interests ongoing for many years of expanding business ties, commercial ties between the two countries. Israel's official position is also similar, but there's an elephant in the room, and that's the US-China standoff. As we heard, it's not going away. The change in administration in the US is not going to change that. So considering that, I'd like to open it up for discussion. Will this Chinese-Israeli high-tech partnership remain unscathed as we go into the next decade? And let's start with Mr. Shagrir.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon in China. I would like to raise, as an opener, 3 points, and then maybe we can develop these 3 points later on in the discussion. The first point I would like to raise is the fact that it is well known that the US is our strongest ally. We have a full commitment for the strategic partnership with the US. We have a close dialogue, and we hear and we heed their concerns. This is one point. Second point is the fact that China is an important economic partner of Israel, and it will continue to be so in the next decade. It is the third largest trade partner of Israel after the US and the EU. It is also the third largest export market for Israel. We hope next year to conclude a free trade agreement between Israel and China, which will help Israelis export and also will help Israeli consumers at home, because it will bring cheaper goods from China and will help competition here in Israel. In addition, investment from China throughout the years in Israel helped to diversify the source of incoming foreign direct investments in Israel. And additionally, all in all, we have good experience in the last decade with China doing infrastructure work in Israel. It helped to bring down prices and more competition, and saved Israel billions of shekels in the last 10 years. In addition, Chinese companies are also contributing in the residential housing sector in Israel. 4 Chinese companies are doing projects in Israel. And we have about 5,000 Chinese construction workers in Israel as a part of a bilateral agreement, which help the government target for more housing, especially for the younger generation. In addition, we have a very good G2G platform between the two countries, the Joint Committee for Innovation Cooperation, which promote cooperation and promote projects that help Israeli companies to showcase their capabilities and penetrate the Chinese market. So basically, we are happy with that. A third point, which I would like to raise, is the issue of regulation. We cannot avoid that, and I think it's a kind of a global phenomenon in the last 2 or 3 years. We see many countries around the world formulating or restructuring a set of regulation that oversee foreign investments in order to protect their national assets. We see that in North America, in Europe, in Asia, Latin America, and we see it even in China. In the last few days, China have announced that they are strengthening their screening for foreign investment in China. Israel has, I need to say, a kind of several mechanism or robust system of mechanism that oversee investments in Israel and also oversee exports from Israel. We have 5 mechanisms, and I will be able to refer later on for that. And this is, you know, in order to create the right balance between free market and between regulation, and the government as a regulator that needs to intervene whenever it needs to intervene. So all in all, my bottom line is that we taking into consideration all the 3 points that I have mentioned is to make the right balance and to make for Israel what is good for its economy and to make what is good for Israel national interests, national security and national resilience.
I'm going to turn the same question over to Dori and Barak. Going forward, you seeing more cooperation, more collaboration, more deals going through in the tech sector between Israeli and Chinese companies?
I see I was muted. Thanks, Ron, for the reminder. Let me take a step back before answering your question and set forth some facts, which I think, and maybe some misconceptions that I think should be put to rest. The first is 95%, if not more, of the Chinese investments in Israeli technology companies are purely financial investments. These are LP investments, these are passive investments, they don't involve the actual acquisition of technology. There's been a perception that whenever a Chinese company invests 10 or 15 or 20% in an Israeli technology company, that company becomes Chinese. That's not the case. Similarly, when Pitango, which is one of the leading Israeli venture capital funds, when they invest in an Israeli technology company and they're here and their board members visit the company all the time, unlike most Chinese investors, they don't control the company, they don't own the company, and they certainly don't have access to the technology. So a lot of the hype and a lot of the concern about Chinese ownership of core Israeli technology, what has really driven what I would call the hysteria around Israel selling off its strategic technology assets to a foreigner, Chinese or otherwise, I think that's wrong. And if you drive around Herzliya Pituach and you actually see which technology companies are controlled by foreigners, Herzliya Pituach is an American enclave. From Microsoft and Apple and the rest of the companies there. So with that, with that perspective, I would say, and I think if you ask most Israeli venture capitalists like me, I manage what I believe to be the largest Chinese-backed fund, or a fund that has a substantial Chinese investment or Chinese limited partners here in Israel. I think if you ask anyone, they'll say we welcome the investment because it's more capital, just as we welcome more German capital and Italian capital and French and American capital. Nevertheless, because of the trade tensions between the United States and Israel, and because of CFIUS rules in the US in particular, and because of concern that an Israeli company with a large Chinese shareholder base will be treated differently in the United States or in Europe, which are traditionally the exit markets for Israeli technology companies, you're finding Israeli companies shying away from taking on board major Chinese limited partners, major Chinese investors, and you've seen a huge shift away from the Chinese venture capital funds. Simultaneously, you've seen 2 trends in China that are affecting the attractiveness of the Israeli investment environment. The first is Chinese companies, after initially, huge enthusiasm about the Israeli market, most Chinese companies, be they strategic or financial investors, understood that the Israeli market is dominated by early stage startups that don't have a very don't have a very well established product or market, which they initially thought they had. And I think that that has caused a lot of Chinese companies to shy away. And the second big trend is, and I think this is true for all of the outbound Chinese technology investments, Chinese companies have come to realize that just because you invest in a foreign technology company doesn't mean you're going to become their distributor, their joint venture partner, their integration partner in China itself. And that has caused a lot of strategic Chinese technology investors to shy away from foreign investment generally. It just hasn't achieved the objectives which it sought to achieve. Now, putting all that aside, you'll still have Chinese financial investors, just like the Israeli market here is dominated by American financial investors and European financial investors. Those investors will continue to come into Israel. But the kind of strategic nature of that initial opening of the floodgates of Chinese investment, I think we'll never see again. This is not just in Israel, it's Chinese investors in technology globally have pulled back with the expectation that they're going to insource technology. If they want to buy something, if they want to buy a technology, they generally have to buy the company. And as most Chinese companies have discovered over the past 3 or 4 years in particular, it is very, very challenging for a Chinese group to buy a company overseas and manage it well. You see many, many examples. Tnuva is one big example, but you see this all over Africa and South Asia and the United States with Chinese companies frustrated that it's not so easy to manage a foreign company from China. And therefore, there's been a great, let's call it withdrawal from those type of investments, which was the bulk of Chinese outbound investment capital.
Thanks, Dorian. There's some great insights there, and we'll get back to some of them. Let's turn it over now to Mr. Zhao Hai. Opening thoughts about the topic at large. Don't forget to unmute.
All right, thank you. Thank you for Signal's invitation to join this distinguished panel. And I totally agree with the major points presented by Mr. Chagrier and Mr. Barak. And I think it's critical at this moment to understand the nature of China-Israel technology cooperation, because this is a win-win situation for both countries. I want to emphasize from China's perspective and how and why at this point Chinese Israeli technology, just as Israeli technology and companies and Israel as the state need Chinese market. Because China has undergoing this tremendous transformation of its own economy. It's climbing the value chain and gradually developing to a so-called high quality economic development. It has set up goals for the next 15 years to reach a middle income country in the world. Therefore, it has to maintain a relatively fast economic growth, about 4.7% every year. So in that respect, and also adding the factor that China's population is aging very quickly. Just recently, China reported that by 2025, China's population will reach its top. And then after that, the total labor stock will decrease. So if you add that together, I think more and more you see that China is paying more and more attention and put innovation at the central position of China's economic growth. Therefore, it has to widen and diversify its sources of technology. So on the one hand, you see a very large input domestically from the state, both from the state and from companies. Overall, by now, China's average R&D input every year is climbing up and catching up with developed world. On the other hand, China is actively purchasing foreign technology and foreign companies in order to get around some of the very hard stage of developing startup technologies. So this is because of fierce domestic competition, because now in the Chinese market, you have to have technology advantage to expand your business quickly. So therefore, one of the ways for business to take advantage of foreign technology is that they can expand, they can get the technology and save the time of developing those technology and then apply to Chinese big market, expanding its market base very quickly. So in that respect, I think Israel is a very good target to acquire those kind of technologies because the competition, this very good innovation environment in Israel, and how Israel is very connected to the overall innovation base in the United States. So that actually created a ecological environment in which both China, United States, and Israel can benefit. And the second point is that because of the military and the national security concern on the US side, in many ways, I agree with Mr. Barak that this is historical. And in many ways, this is really overemphasis on national security and overlapping national security with commercial interest that prevent further Israel cooperation with China on technology. So right now, the word of the day is that the US is following the policy of presumption of denial. Basically, their entity list of putting more and more Chinese companies onto those lists, and therefore to acquire technology, you have to, from the Chinese perspective, you have to assume that those high tech is from the very beginning denied to China, and China has to get around it to acquire more technology that includes today's Israel. So moving forward, I think on the one hand, because China is following this new policy called dual circulation, China is paying more attention to its domestic economic circulation and paying more attention of innovation domestically. But there actually will increase demand for domestic and foreign technology. So Israel is very well positioned to feed in those technology to China and become a very good partner for China. So I think in that respect, China-Israel cooperation on technologies has very bright future. However, on the other hand, because the closeness of Israel and the United States, and because the US has long-arm jurisdiction over other countries to impose financial technology export controls, therefore, we have many hurdles to get around if the overall environment of so-called US-China rivalry is worsening in the future, even if the Biden administration it has some change of minds or sort of a minor change of policy, but the overall environment will be quite negative. So I think we have to get around that. So overall, I think we have to balance the two. On the one hand, to balance the market and interest. On the other hand, to take care of the boundaries of national security. If we can solve those problems with Israel play a very active role in between, I think the future is still very much desirable.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now, we're starting to get some questions, comments in the chat room. But before we get to those, I'd like to, we've been talking in kind of generalities, Israeli tech, Israeli innovation. I'd like to put some meat on those bones, so to speak, and just quickly go around the table and hear what specific technological or innovative sectors we're seeing potential for cooperation. Let's start with Mr. Shagrir. I mean, can you kind of specify what Israeli capabilities, technological capabilities, it is that Chinese investors, government are most interested in?
Well, I can refer to the Joint Committee for Innovation Cooperation. This is the G2G platform, which I just told you about, which include 13 ministries and government agencies from each side. And we promote, as I said, cooperation and projects in the areas of health, agriculture, water, and environment, education, and transportation. We think there is a great potential in these areas, and we think it is, as I said, very, very beneficial for the two countries. Only this week we inaugurated our embassy in Beijing, promoted two big projects. One is agricultural demonstration farm in Gansu, that we're in the province of Gansu, which was inaugurated just last week, and this week another big project in a big hospital in Beijing, which showcase Israeli medical device technology and emergency preparedness technologies. And we think it's a good way to have this two government umbrella, which allows Israeli companies to enter the Chinese market. So these are the areas that I would put my finger on.
Thank you. Barak, maybe, we heard from Mr. Shagir about, the government initiatives. What about the private sector?
So I think he's right that ag, health, and water / environmental are the main areas of interest. On the Chinese side, it used to be able to add to that kind of mobility, smart city, public safety, emergency management. That's no longer the case, as far as I know. Most Chinese integrators are shying away from using Israeli technology, and there's a real push to use solely domestic technology for these things. Look, I think we need to be practical. The areas for cooperation are great. There's certainly a lot of export potential for Israeli companies, especially in the pharma, medical devices, and ag space, to export products and services in some cases when COVID ends, because those usually require human delivery to China. And there's obviously huge numbers of imports of Chinese goods, particularly consumer goods, that are going to continue coming to Israel. Deep tech collaboration, I think this is an area you're going to see less and less cooperation. I mean, it's nice to put a warm veneer on the relationship, but I think that there has been China has generally stepped back from engaging on technology with Western companies. This is a function of two things. First of all, Chinese innovation is increasing. Chinese companies, take Huawei, for example, which is the elephant in the room here. I mean, Huawei does its own innovation. It's an incredibly innovative company. They invest a huge amount in R&D, and the Chinese government, the Chinese economy invests a tremendous amount in technology R&D. By the way, you've seen a fall off in the West in these areas. I mean, the reason Cisco is not as dominant as Huawei is in hardware, Cisco just stopped investing in this stuff. They're managed for earnings per share, quarterly earnings, share price increases in share price, and they're less about development for the sake of development. That's something that characterizes China today. So I think you're going to see much less deep tech cooperation between Israel and China going forward. I think the current trade war in the US is only reinforcing a shift that the business people have seen for the past couple of years. But it's obviously going to deepen it. As I mentioned, Israeli technology companies, especially startups, they look to the United States and to Europe for exits. We are not a country known for building enormous technology companies that will last and last and last, like you find in the US or Europe, that are expected to IPO and continue to grow. The vast majority, that's not to say there aren't some that do that, but the vast majority of Israeli technology companies are interested in reaching a certain size and product maturity and market dominance, and then selling themselves to foreigners. The exit markets for that are in the United States and Europe, to a certain extent in Japan and South Asia, but primarily the United States and Europe. And as a result, people will not do anything, or entrepreneurs, boards, CEOs won't do anything to endanger the company's growth prospects in the West. And if that means rejecting or shying away from, or just not viewing favorably funds and investment from China, the companies will do that. And that certainly is the direction the market's going today. If you speak to any CEOs and you ask them, who are your preferred investors today? 3 years ago, you would have heard Chinese at some point in asking that question. Today, you won't hear it.
All right, thank you, Mr. Barak. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Hai, and maybe with the twist to the question, how much does government policy or national policy dictate the areas of interest there for Chinese businesses?
Well, I think in China, everybody knows that the Chinese government played a very important role in pushing forward with certain areas of technology. Actually, if you look at the numbers, Chinese state investment in R&D is much bigger than other developed countries. And Chinese companies' investment in R&D is increasing. However, overall, if you look at the picture, only a small number of big tech companies in China are investing big in R&D. Companies like Huawei that you just mentioned by Barak, and also other big tech companies like Tencent or Alibaba. However, if you look at the overall number across different industries, only in telecommunication, and in certain areas of AI, big data, that China has more patent and technology advancement. But in other areas like biomedical or areas where Israel has advantage, like agriculture, technology, environment, and many other areas, China is still lagging behind. So I would say that overall, I mean, not specifically referring to Israel, but China needs in many areas more cooperation, not less, with the outside world. It's just a matter of through what channel and towards where that China can secure can have secure technology that can have a long-term viable cooperation relationship. And the other thing I want to emphasize is that because of the US-China trade war and tech war, the China today realized, more importantly, the basic research, scientific research is fundamentally important. So China, if you look at the new plan for the future, for the next 5 years, China will invest much more in basic scientific research than before, not just to applications. So I think in that respect, if you look at the space technology, deep ocean exploration, and many chemical and physical science, mathematics, China will have intention to increase cooperation with universities, research centers around the world. And China now is looking at potential areas outside of the US if the tie is cut and not resumed after Biden administration. So maybe Europe is a good destination, and we definitely would look at Israel, but it depends on how much national security will play into this kind of future-oriented technology research cooperation across the border.
All right, thank you for that. I'm going to open this up, start fielding some questions from the chat room. This is from Zhang Chuan. She's from Fudan University in China, asking about those civilian technologies being defined as dual use by the US. Is Israel following US standards to categorize civilian technology and dual using technology? Ending with Toda in Hebrew. I guess that's a question for Mr. Shagrir.
Yeah. As I've mentioned in my opening remarks, Israel have 5 different mechanisms to oversee export and to oversee investments in Israel, including 2 mechanisms for export, one for defense good, which is non-relevant to China, and the other one is the dual use and sensitive goods mechanism which sits within the Ministry of Economy. And we work by international list and international standards, and this mechanism works very well and works for many years already now. As I've said, we have also different mechanisms that oversee investments in Israel. We have the land authority mechanism, again, functioning already for so many years, which means that any foreigners or any foreign entity that would like to buy or acquire land in Israel, it needs to go through this mechanism. I'm not sure many countries have this kind of mechanism, but we do have. We have also a privatization mechanism, and this is part of the privatization process that we are undergoing in Israel. For example, now we're going to privatize the old ports in Haifa, and this is also another mechanism. And I need to say these mechanisms are non-partial and unbiased. And the additional 5th mechanism that just came into place at the beginning of 2020 is the advisory committee, which advised 9 Israeli regulators when there is a need to advise them about the foreign direct investments in Israel. So all in all, it's a mechanism of 5 different mechanisms that give quite a comprehensive solution. Yet, I must say, it's from my perspective, regulation is never enough. I think there is a need also for awareness. and also more information for, especially for the private sector, when they do business with China or considering doing business in China, they need to have the full information, full knowledge as to the ongoing or changing regulation, as to some barriers that might be legal procedure, dispute resolution, and they should consider all the opportunities and risks before taking a decision. So it's a combination of regulation, of a balanced regulation and awareness.
Excellent, thank you. Another question from the chat room this time. This is for Mr. Hai from a user in Berlin, asking if you can comment on the civil-military integration in China as promoted by the administration, by President Xi Jinping. Maybe give a brief explanation what he's referring to.
Yeah, I think you have to understand that the civil-military integration is part of the overall Chinese military modernization program. When President Xi Jinping is looking at the Chinese military and look at the current world, you realize that technology plays a very key role in the next generation of warfighting in the world, and it's very important to modernize China's military. However, he look at the previous generation of China's military industry, it's very much closed. You have close to a dozen big military companies that produce only for the military. It has no it's very big and not easy to move and change its technology, update its technology very quickly. So the very idea of civil military integration is actually coming from the United States. When China's looking at the US and China's trying to learn from the US, where the US has an open procurement program, you have the defense department that send out orders, but then you gather the civil companies that are producing particularly for the military. So that way, I think the original idea for China, the civil military integration, is to open up the system to integrate more civil suppliers to the military to lower the cost and increase flexibility and adaptability for the next generation technology. And also, on the other hand, we're also, because of the old sort of Soviet style military system, you have the old institutions, military academies, institutions that are producing domestically technologies that can be used for commercial activity. However, the technology is locked up within the military, not being commercialized. So the other way around for the civil military integration is that so that those military developed technologies, just like the US developed microwave or GPS, those kind of high tech can one day be transformed and transferred to civilian use. So this kind of idea is very much learning from advanced countries, and hopefully that China's military can, because of this, on the one hand, reduce the overall number of personnel, like President Xi promised to reduce about 300,000 people. On the other hand, increase its capacity to its warfighting capacity. I think that's the idea. And right now, because of this, I think US is looking at this and thinking this is a way for Chinese military to utilize sort of civilian companies to acquire either openly or secretively foreign technology to the use of Chinese military. I think that's a very narrow interpretation and wrong interpretation of this whole program. And I think if you look at this in the right way, you won't be fear this too much and be historical about the application of this program.
Excellent, thank you so much for these insights. And a question now to Dorian. User named Halom Shirman is asking, is Fosun investment in Israel a successful example of strategic investment by in Israeli companies from China? Maybe let's expand this a bit wider, and can you give us a good example of where business ties have materialized and resulted in successes?
So Fosun is a very good example. I mean, acquisitions of companies like Ahava or Tnuva, frankly, are very, very good examples of these. And I think there have been a lot of management challenges. From what I hear, I think from what everyone hears in the market. Just shifting slightly away from your question, if you'll allow me to take a step sideways. The question is, are there a lot of examples of these acquisitions and are they successful? So the answer is there aren't a lot of examples. Some have been successful, some have not been. And I think that this takes me back to a point that Mr. Shabrir made. There have, the concern that has been raised by the United States in particular about Israeli technology collaboration with China, put defense aside for a moment. Every country has export limitations and limitations on the ability to invest in national security assets or companies that have defense and security implications for the country. But looking at the broader Chinese investment in Israeli technology and the broader investment or providing services to Israeli infrastructure, Israel has done I think a brilliant job of balancing its very warm and critically important relationship with the United States, Israel's main international partner, and certainly its only superpower or quasi-superpower partner, and the interest it has vis-a-vis China, which is becoming one of its great trading partners and which is on pace to be the largest economy in the world by mid-century. And we see this in many areas, but two areas that have been mentioned on this webinar. The first is infrastructure. Nobody in Israel actually believes, nobody who's actually given it thought in Israel actually believes that digging tunnels or digging subways creates any type of national security advantage to China in Israel. And that's why I think from an infrastructure perspective, Israeli companies and the Israeli government is looking for the cheapest provider of a quality solution, and they're finding that in China. At the same time, most Israeli policymakers, certainly the ones I speak to, and of course, Mr. Shabrir is in an official position, he can't speak as openly as I can, but most people I speak to will tell you, we haven't really seen a lot of examples of Chinese companies coming in here and taking over technology. And if the fear really is, and this is the fear of the United States, that the Chinese will somehow reverse engineer Israeli technology, they can do that by buying the product and reverse engineering it. It doesn't require an investment. Certainly a passive investment, a financial investment, doesn't give them that leg up. So to the original question, I'll tell you, there haven't been a lot of examples. Some have been more successful, some have been less successful. But in general, when people speak about the risk or challenge or balancing act that Israel has to play, it's more of a virtual than an actual concern. You do not have a lot of Israeli companies being acquired by Chinese companies. It's very rare. And in the few cases, or I shouldn't say in the few cases, in the cases where really high technology Israeli products and services may or may not be of strategic interest to the Chinese, their Chinese counterparts, the easiest way for anyone to get access to these products is actually just to buy them off the shelf and not to make an investment. So much of the discussion about investment review boards and the like is what I would put in the realm of virtual rather than something with actual practical relevance.
All right. Our chat won't let us get away from this topic. Just stressing animosity or the difficult ties between China and the U.S. The question, we have several Chinese business executives have recently stated that U.S. sanctions will increase Chinese investments in Israeli tech. Can you speak to the logic of that and whether you think that might be a knockout effect? Let's go around the table, starting with Mr. Shabrir.
Yeah, I think it's a question more for Dorian to answer. But if I look at the numbers of, let's say, 2019 or 18, I agree with Dorian. I look at the numbers of Chinese investments here in Israel, less than 1 billion. If I remember right, according to IVC data, it was about 3. If I take out the infrastructure investment, only investment in the Israeli high-tech, I think the number is around 3% of the overall foreign direct investments in Israel in 2019. By the way, at that year, the Japanese investments in Israel, which we also work very hard to bring to Israel, were higher, around 4.5% of the overall direct investments in Israel. And by the way, we have investments from other Asian players, which is also important for Israel economy, like India, Singapore, Korea, and others. It's important to diversify as much as you can the sources of the foreign investments in Israel. So if I look at the numbers, I don't see increase or a rush here to Israel to get Israeli technologies. Yet again, I need to get back to what I said in the beginning. You know, we are following very closely the US-China path, and we take into consideration. And again, I would say we hear and heed what they have to say in that respect.
All right, so Balak, Mr. Shagrir appointed you as the person to answer this. Sanctions might have the opposite effect and actually increase investment?
I don't think that's going to happen.
I
think sanctions are going to increase any investment. You're talking about sanctions increasing investment in Israeli technology, meaning sanctions vis-a-vis the US increasing interest in Israel? Is that the question?
Sanctions by the US on China will increase investments in Israel.
Number one, I don't see it happening. It hasn't happened in the past. I don't see it happening here. Number two, I think that if it were a trend that was real, the Israeli government would take action. But you have to remember, sanctions they generally target the sale of technology, not the investment in technology. So it's not like Chinese firms are being banned from investing in the US. Certainly there's CFIUS reviews, but that's had such a deterrent effect that nobody's going to go down the pathway of making a significant investment or acquisition because of perception of what will happen. It'll be rejected. It's a waste of time and money and energy. I think what you do see though is you do see a lot of the American technologies, or you saw, there's a recent list. Did you see this recent list of about 50 companies in China that have been sanctioned? They can't be sold, or there are restrictions on sale. By the way, during the same Department of Commerce directive, they took Ben Gurion University off the sanctions list. If anyone saw that, you should Google it just to see it because it's insane. Look, you have to understand, the reason the United States is prohibiting the sale of these technologies is not really, and this is knowledgeable American policymakers will tell you, it's not because they think this is going to somehow affect the ability of Chinese companies to develop. This is part of a trade war. This is part of American frustration over a growing or persistent trade deficit. This is about American frustration over continued Chinese innovation and development. Very little is going to change as a result of these sanctions. But it's America sending a signal, and it's also, I think, preparing for eventually a grand compromise when negotiations take place. Israelis, we love to think that we're central to the world and that every dispute has an Israeli angle. This dispute has no Israeli angle. We just have to be very, very careful not to alienate our big brother in America and our very, very good friends in China. And I think that delicate balancing act, if you look at all the countries within the, let's call it very, very direct American sphere of influence, no one has done it as well as Israel. It's actually a remarkable foreign policy triumph that few people speak about. How does Israel continue to support burgeoning trade with China? Exchange of ideas, exchange of people, the Chinese capabilities being brought to Israel, especially in the infrastructure space, while maintaining that very, very close security cooperation and reassuring the Americans that nothing we're doing in any way affects our relationship with them or is going to compromise American national security. That's been a very delicate balance that's been, I think, expertly managed. People in Israel are used to criticizing their government. That's part of it. It's a national pastime to criticize the government, especially when it comes to foreign policy, domestic policy as well. This is really unquestionably Israel's great foreign policy achievement vis-a-vis China is developing the relationship while at the same time reassuring the Americans that it doesn't impact our very, very close and unique relationship with the United States.
Really, really well put there. I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Hai. A balancing act that Israel's been carrying out for years now. Can it last though? Are one of the sides or one of the superpowers going to eventually demand or just create a situation where Israel is forced to choose?
I don't think so. I think the current Israeli foreign policy towards both US and China can continue. And I think Israel has played this brilliantly. And I think this current course can be maintained for a foreseeable future. But of course, there are difficulties, and US-China will face a lot of hurdles in the future. I want to refer to the previous comments very quickly. First, I agree with Mr. Shangrier. If you look at the numbers, China is still a very small part of the overall Israeli foreign investment received from overseas. So there's great potential to increase that. And I think if the US has more sanctions on China, of course, from what I heard also, that Chinese business community has a increasing interest of investing in Israel. But of course, there are problems as Israel is very much close with the United States in terms of security and military relations. So that's a problem. And secondly, I think if you look at the increase of foreign investment from China in the past couple of years, particularly the BRI project, many of those are because of the US and China's monetary policy. If you look at the graph, there's a very sudden jump of foreign investment because China accumulate a huge amount of dollars that's actually feeded by Fed. So that's one of the reasons. And then there's a collapse of investment, both to the United States, to Europe, and to Israel, because China's deleveraging, because the US is increasing its interest rate, changes monetary policy. And also because of CFIUS reform, the FIRMA law, China in the past year decreased its investment in the United States by 92%. So that's a complete crash of foreign investment to the United States. And if you look at other markets, it's not much better because overall, I think the supply of money is tightening. However, this year, the situation is changing because since last year, US start to, again, going towards quantitative easing and enlarge of its balance sheet. So the monetary policy change will again give China incentive to increase in its investments overseas in the coming years. But that's another story. And third, I think in terms of trade war, I mean, trade balance is not really a concern for the United States, probably a concern for President Trump. But actually, if the United States, without sanction, and actually reduce its export control, it can increase its technology export to China dramatically. Before the Trump administration, China and the US actually negotiated this. If the US reduces its restriction, it can increase about 20% of its export overall to China. And that will contribute to the balancing of US-China trading that instead of making it more imbalanced. So I think if you look at the overall picture, if the political environment is warming up a little bit and the barriers of trade, investment, and technology will be lessened and more clearly defined, my hope is that China's investment in Israel will increase in many technology startup and in many areas, in many technologies. The other thing is that actually Israel has strategically positioned its presence in China. There are a lot of industrial parks in China where Israel companies are working and investing. And I think the Chinese market will be very much attractive in the future to Israel technology companies overall. So I think this is a two-way street, and China and Israel technology cooperation can be bright if the national security of the United States can be managed well. Thank you.
Nice summary there. Dorian, I saw you wanted to react. We have a minute left in the session, so I'm going to let you close us off. Go ahead.
I'll say this, there's no question we are seeing a great decoupling of technology and economic activity in certain sectors between the West and the East. By the West, I mean the United States-led bloc, and by the East, I mean China in particular. This will continue. All indications are that it will continue. Israel has the unique situation of being a Western country that tends to do, relatively speaking, a huge amount of business in China. This has a number of reasons. First of all, Israelis are quick on their feet and they pursue opportunities. We don't have a domestic market. We look for export markets. we can't shift away and say, okay, we'll invest more at home in the local market because there is no market here. Also, Israelis don't view cultural differences typically as great barriers, and you'll see them continuing to target the Chinese market. I see huge opportunities continued for Israeli exports, particularly in the health space, the agricultural space, the environmental space, as Mr. Shabir mentioned. But I do see a big change from where we were 3-4 years ago in terms of the numbers and quantity of Chinese investment we're going to see in Israel. I think it's going to be pretty dry. The good news for the Israeli economy is Chinese investment in Israeli technology is not a huge proportion of total investments in Israeli tech. So the aggregate effects on us are going to be minimal.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. That's all the time we had. Thank you for people who send in questions from the chat. Mr. Hai, Mr. Shagrir, Mr. Barak, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to turn this back over to Carice for the remainder of the webinar today.
Thank you so much, Ron, for that incredibly interesting discussion. Outstanding speakers. I'm truly delighted to be here with two old friends from China and Israel. Professor Niu Xinchun is the director of the Institute of Middle East Studies at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, better known as KICR, one of China's most respected research institutes. Professor Niu is a former deputy director of KICR's Institute of American Studies, which makes him particularly valuable for these sessions. And in fact, he moved to the Middle East Institute around the time when Signal first visited KICR in 2011. I'm also very pleased to be joined by one of Israel's most experienced Middle East experts, a fluent Arabic speaker. Ehud Yaari is a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and a Middle East commentator for Channel 12's TV news in Israel, and in fact has been a Middle East TV news commentator here since 1975. So let's get started. What is China doing in the Middle East? What's actually happening? For all the changes of 2020, we see this region continues to be volatile and remains a stage for great power rivalry. China's traditionally engaged with the region through economics, purchasing oil, selling goods, a process that has definitely intensified over the past few years, with 1 million Chinese living, studying, and working across the Middle East. In 2016, China became the largest foreign investor here, and that is in no small part due to the Belt and Road Initiative, which crosses the Middle East to get to Europe. Meanwhile, China has friendly relations with all the regional protagonists, pursuing a delicate balancing act, for example, between Iran and Israel, Iran and Saudi Arabia. So let's start by having our guests set the stage for the audience from each of your perspectives. What is China actually doing in the Middle East, and what does it want from the Middle East? Professor Niu, let's start with you. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. I would think in the past decade, China has greatly increased its economic political presence in the Middle East, especially in economic area. China's trade with the Middle East, China's direct investment in the Middle East has rapidly increased. But in the political area, China still very low profile. I think in political area, China's main influence in the Middle East issue is manifested its voting power in UN Security Council. And in political area, China do not have political allies in the Middle East. And in military area, China have a very limited influence. Its influence almost can be negligible. China is the only big power which do not have a military base in the Middle East. And China's arms sales to the Middle East is very small. And China's arms sale to the Middle East just account for about 2 to 3% of the arms bought by the Middle East. At the same time, United States account for about half of the arms bought by the Middle East. So on the one hand, our economic interest and economic presence are huge in the Middle East. In the foreseeable future, China's economic involvement in the Middle East will continue to increase. But on the other hand, political influence and security influence are very limited. Personally, I think in the foreseeable future, China will continue the current policy. So that there is questions frequently asked by Chinese scholars and foreign scholars is that how can China protect its economic interest without enough political influence and military influence? Whether China will increase its political involvement and military involvement in the near future. I think personally, I would say so far so good. Until now, China has almost effectively protected its investment and trade relationship with the Middle East. But for the future, I don't think anyone knows the answer. But in my personal opinion, I don't think in the foreseeable future, China will significantly increase its political involvement and military involvement, because most of Chinese people still think that the Middle East is a very dangerous place. So we are very cautious to increase political and military involvement. The United States and the Soviet Union and UK, France have very good lessons for China to learn. I think I stopped here.
Well, you covered a lot of ground, intercepted some of my future questions. Ehud, from the region, what's your perspective on what China wants and what it's actually doing?
Hello, everybody, and surprise, surprise, I have to say that I completely agree with the analysis of Professor New. This is the same, we read, or I read the same way, the trajectory of Chinese involvement in the region. Maybe I'll fire quickly few bullets, just statements about the way I see the Chinese involvement in the region, and then we can have a discussion. Number one, I think it's important to emphasize that the Middle East is not a primary objective of China's Belt and Road and other strategic plan. China is mainly interested in the Euro-Asian landmass and that peninsula of Eurasia, which is called Europe. And therefore, the railways and the roads are much more important than the maritime belt. And that means that the inner regions of Eurasia are more important than those countries on the coasts, my opinion. Number two, when the Chinese take a look at the Middle East, what they see from Beijing is what we see from here. The Arab nation, helpless, hopeless, and jobless. And I don't expect the official Chinese officials to ever put it in public, but they understand that we have been witnessing the implosion, the collapse of political Arabism, the weakening of the states, and in the region, to the extent China is interested, there are three players, non-Arabs: Shiite, Iran; Sunni, Turkey; Jewish, Israel. That's the Middle East as I think they see it from China. Now, China doesn't want to get immersed in the turbulent conflict of the region. Rightly said, there is no advantage in that. And China has to take, and I'm sure it does take into account the possibility that there will be collisions, major ones, down the road between the regional players. Israel, Iran, Iran, Turkey, Turkey and some of the Arab states. I wouldn't exclude these scenarios. And when I'm speaking about collision, I think the Chinese also understand that we can have a major military clashes that are short or full-out war and can extend for weeks, if not more. Now, I think that the Chinese were able to successfully gain major economic footholds in the region and trade advantages. The Arab Gulf is going to be Huawei. Chinese vaccinations, I think today they are beginning to arrive in Turkey. They are already being injected in UAE and other places. And we can go on and on. In this economic competition between China and the West, China and the US, the Chinese have clearly the upper hand, and I think it's going to continue. Within brackets, I would say, I've learned a lot from your previous session, Caris. It was most enlightening in terms of how Israel fits in the picture. Now, China is treading carefully and will tread carefully. So for example, when people are talking about this 25-year, $400 billion agreement with Iran, I don't think there is much in this, because I do not think that China wants to be in a position where it has to choose between its very close, expensive links with the Gulf states, mainly Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc., and its relations with Iran. So this balancing act will go on as far as we can see. A caveat: China has learned that the messy Middle East, as I call it, can bring trouble to Beijing on very sensitive issues to China. And here I'm speaking about SL, Somaliland. Somaliland is an independent state, de facto, not recognized. And it controls a long coastline leading to the Red Sea, where the containers of Chinese exports should go to Europe. And Somaliland has decided, for whatever reasons, President Musa Bihi had at the time, and we can go into it, but it's not that important, that he is going to be best friends with Taiwan. And the Taiwanese jumped, and they are in Hargeisa and the port of Berbera, and maybe the port that people are, the naval base that people are thinking of building in Zayla someday in the future. I'm sure China doesn't want a second Somaliland in this respect. Where is the, one more word, as we were in Somaliland, and previous and formerly French Somali, Djibouti, I think people widely exaggerate the significance, both military and political, of the Chinese base in Djibouti. This is mainly logistics, and it's overshadowed by the presence of 6 other military bases there, certainly Fort Limonnier, where the Americans are operating big time. I think that the Chinese government has priorities in the region, and it is the major Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE. Second is Egypt, where we see substantial Chinese investments. Ethiopia, but Ethiopia is formally, at least, out of the Middle East, and more with Turkey. And I think it's very comfortable for China to let the Americans maintain whatever forces they have in the region and let the region sort out its problems, although I remind everybody that Foreign Minister Wang Yi offered some forum to resolve issues of the region and get security arrangements going between Iran and its rivals in the Gulf. But China is not pushing for that. There is no diplomatic effort to move this idea forward. So I believe, to conclude, I believe that China knows that America is not going to leave the region, may scale down its profile, but the Americans have shown, for example, in Syria, and very important in Iraq, which is a prime objective of Chinese investments now, maybe more than others. The Americans have shown that with a very, very small footprint, like in Northeast Syria, like in Iraq, they are able to do the job. And what 500 American soldiers east of the Euphrates River are doing in Syria, controlling 2/5 of the land with the agricultural lands and the oil fields, etc., the Russians are unable to do with the air force and naval bases that they have in the other part of Syria. China knows America is going to stay in the region. China knows that it's not only China that is dependent on oil and gas from the Gulf, but the Gulf states and Iran are also dependent to no less degree on China to export their products. So I think we'll keep seeing more of the same in the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Okay, Ehud, thanks so much. As usual, very comprehensive and in-depth. I want to pick up on what you said regarding the potential for a collision. Professor Niu, as China continues in its balancing act, and if you agree that the US will stay in the region and China is not yet ready to move into any kind of significant security role, what do you see China doing, or perhaps even behind the scenes, if the tensions rise and we see some kind of serious conflagration in the offing, or even closer than that? Professor Niu, unmute yourself. Unmute. Please unmute yourself.
Okay, I completely agree with Professor Ehud's opinion. Firstly, United States will stay, and secondly, China will continue to be reluctant to increase its security involvement. And at the international level, United States is to some extent disengaging from the Middle East, reduce its commitment to the Middle East countries. And at the same time, Russia has increased its military presence in the Middle East. In some country or some hard point, Russia can challenge the United States militarily, like in Syria and Libya. And in economic areas, if we take EU as one entity, EU's economic influence in the Middle East is larger than United States. And China's economic influence and economic presence in the Middle East has rapidly increased. In the future, it is possible that China's economic influence can be competitive with the United States' economic influence. So at the international level, there are a few big powers to play in the Middle East. That is a new change, because in the past 2 decades after the Cold War ended, United States almost has been the only superpower in the Middle East, but now the situation has changed. At the regional level, as Professor Afud said, that there are more players in the Middle East. Arab countries, Israel, Iran, and Turkey will be the major players in the Middle East. So it is inevitable there are collision between the local players and the international players. So what will China deal with the new situation? I think for China, my personal opinion is that the basic principle will continue to be non-intervention. We hope that in the future, the Middle East will owned by Middle East countries and Middle East people. The Middle East will be managed by Middle East country and Middle East peoples. So I don't think China will follow the United States and the Soviet Union and the UK's footstep to increase its military presence in the Middle East. We hope the United States will continue to play positive role in the United States, in the Middle East. We hope United States do not irresponsibly withdraw from the Middle East. We hope the Middle East can reach its power balance by local players. I stop here.
Thank you. So the Middle East, for the Middle East and by the Middle East, but at the same time, although both of you have painted a relatively tranquil picture from what we sometimes might be hearing in the newspapers and when we talk to different players, we do know that the US has been putting ongoing pressure on its allies in the region in different ways with respect to China. So let me just come back to you quickly, Professor Neo. How is China responding to this pressure that is coming from the US on these local countries?
Firstly, I think the logic is that the United States pressure on Israel and Saudi Arabia and other its allies. The reason is not China's interest in the Middle East is conflicting with the interest of the United States in the Middle East. The reason is the conflict between China and the United States has been spilled over into Middle East. Firstly, I don't think we have a conflicting interest between United States and China. The reason is that China's main focus in the Middle East is in economic areas. And the United States' main focus in the Middle East in political and security areas. Actually, I think generally speaking, China and the United States' interest in the Middle East is compatible, complementary, because both United States and China want a peaceful and prosperous Middle East. Both the United States and China have a huge trade relationship with the Middle East. We have a huge investment in the Middle East. So we don't have a conflicting interest in the Middle East. China do not have any intention to challenge United States' dominance in the Middle East. The problem is that the deteriorating China-United States relationship has spilled over into the relationship between China and the United States in the Middle East, not the opposite. I stop here.
So, Ehud, from your position, this pressure, we know that we have felt it in Israel and from a series of visits over the course of a year from the various bodies of the US government with respect to just one topic, which was the Haifa port. It touched on the Sorek B desalination plant. In other areas of the Middle East, how do you see them feeling the US pressure, and do they have any kind of feedback from China on this? Please unmute yourself.
I think, Caris, that the Huawei in the Gulf is the best answer. And it's the correct answer in terms of what is really happening. The Gulf states, some of them, are ignoring the American advice. In the same way that when the United States refuses to sell certain weapon systems to some of these countries, they go to China. And in brackets, it's very important for the way that the region will view China in the immediate future is whether China would be willing to help Iran modernize its army with Chinese weapon systems, which are good, but cheaper even than the Russians. And China, of course, can extend credit lines to the empty treasury of the Iranian government. Mr. Putin will have a difficulty doing that. But if China was to take the decision, I think this is crucial, to help the Islamic Republic modernize its army, it can change the attitude of many states in the region, and of course of Israel and the Gulf states, Egypt, etc. Second point I think should be made. As long as China does not possess a blue water navy that can operate consistently in a sustained manner in the Indian Ocean, doesn't make much sense for China to try and play a security role in the region other than anti-piracy operations off the coast of Somali. And it's going to take time. And when China has the fleet that it's building now, it has other priorities, both in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, etc. So watching the Arab states, I think that the answer I have for you, Caris, is that American pressure, to the extent it exists on the Gulf states, Egypt, other countries in the region, doesn't bear much fruit. And one last sentence, if I can, it has to do with, I said Iran, military weapon sales to Iran is a very crucial junction, yes or no? And the other one is whether China would be willing to ignore the reservations of the West and the wider international community, including the Arabs, and embark even partially upon reconstruction of Assadistan. That's the part of Syria that is still under the current regime, without waiting for a constitutional agreement on the future of Syria. That would be also a very meaningful moment. Thank you.
Thanks. We have a couple of questions from the audience, but just briefly, I think we need to respond to a couple of points that Ehud raised. One is the Blue Water Navy. I read actually that China has already a number of ships that are able to be stationed and intended to be stationed in the North Indian Ocean, 5 or 6 of them in the not too distant future. Professor Neo, can you clarify that point?
I have to say that I'm not the expert military, but what I can say is that Middle East is not the first priority of China's global strategy. Actually, Middle East has been always on the backseat of China's global policy. I think from a political and military perspective, Asia Pacific has been always the first priority for China, even if China will develop its Blue Water Navy. Its first priority will be in Asia Pacific, not in Middle East. In my personal opinion, I think in the foreseeable future, China has no any intention to militarily involve in the Middle East. As I mentioned that the previous big powers, United States, Sweden, and UK have taught us a very important lessons that keep away from Middle East trouble.
Thank you. So we have a question from Dale Alouf, who is Signal's Director of Research and Strategy. And he says, for Professor Neo, how does China view the recent normalization of relations between Israel and Arab countries like UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan? How do these developments contrast with China's vision for peace and security in the region? And what does it mean for China's strategy in the Middle East?
I don't know what is China's view, but I can tell you what is my opinion. I think the normalization relations between Israel and the Arab countries, the Abraham Accord, is a good thing, but it is not a perfect one. The reason is that I think for China, or for the relationship between Israel and Arab countries, there are two important problems. The first problem is the relationship between Israel and Palestinians. The second problem is the relationship between Arab country and Israel. For us, the perfect solution is that Israel can solve the two problems at one time, at one stroke. You can solve the Palestinian problem and the Arab problem at the same time. That is the perfect one. But the reality is that in the past 2 or 3 decades, the Israel want to solve the Palestinian problems first, then turn attention to the Arab-Israel relationship. But obviously it has failed. So now the Arab countries and Israel changed its logic. You want to solve the relationship between Arab country and Israel first, and then solve the Palestinian problems. So there are 2 scenarios in the future. The one scenario is that the normalization between Israel and Arab countries is helpful to solve the Palestinian problems. That is a good one. And the other scenario is that the normalization of Israel and Arab countries actually make the Palestinian problems more difficult to solve. That is the worst one. So we hope the better one will come.
Thank you very much. Ehud, you mentioned in your opening remarks, you touched on the priorities, the countries that are priority for China in the Middle East, and you put them, I think, maybe in prioritized order, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and then Egypt. I want to ask you about Egypt because it's extremely important for Israel that Egypt stays stable. I wanted to ask you, China's building the new capital city, doing other major infrastructure projects, setting up Huawei's 5G there. How important do you see China's contribution to maintaining stability in Egypt? Please unmute yourself. Thanks.
Yes, I think Egypt is one, if not the primary target of the Chinese in the region, because Egypt sits on the Suez Canal. And that's where the containers go to Europe and come back. So the focus is there. And then, by the way, on the Red Sea. I believe that Egypt is in a dire economic situation. I believe information about the true state of the finances of the Egyptian government is not really available. I think it would be interesting to see if General Sisi, President Sisi, really start privatizing the economic corporations owned by the Egyptian army. And if he does, are we going to see Chinese corporations buying these companies? Because as you know, the Egyptian domestic market, the Egyptian economy is dominated by the Egyptian military. The Egyptian military is a huge business corporation. And now apparently Sisi has decided to accept the advice of economists, both Egyptians and foreigners, to start privatizing. It would be very interesting if the army starts releasing chunks of the Egyptian economy, whether it's taken over by China. I have difficulty seeing major American companies going there under the current circumstances. So generally, I think that the fact that China is involved in Egypt, that it's investing in Egypt, but at the same time, Egypt remains very close ally of the US, maintaining close cooperation security-wise with Israel, etc. We don't go now into the whole mess of the Eastern Mediterranean basin, but I think it's helpful because there are two horror scenarios for a guy like me. The first horror scenario, and I used to live years in Egypt. The first horror scenario is that this nation of 100 million people will collapse. What happens then? The second horror scenario is that the ancient empire of Ethiopia will implode. I pray not. But what started now with Tigray can recur in other provinces. So everything which is done by the West, by China, to prevent this horror scenario, I'm speaking of Egypt now, I think should be very welcome.
Thank you. We've had a few questions asking Professor Neo about the how the China's Muslim population attitude towards Islam influences its relations with the Middle East overall and its attitudes towards the Middle East. Professor Neo, can you speak to that?
Can you please repeat your question?
Basically asking what does China's domestic Muslim population and China's views of Islam impact? How does it impact China's views of the Middle East and its actions in the Middle East?
I think in my personal opinion, in the past decades, China has increasingly took a domestic Muslim issue separating from the Middle East policy. Actually, I don't see there are very clear connection between China's Middle East policy and China's domestic policy towards the Muslim community. In the past 2 decades, China has invested huge economic resources into the west part of China to stabilize this region and to increase the economic prosperity in the region. In the past decades, the west part of China is very stable. So I don't see there is a direct connection between the two things. That's all.
Thank you. We have a question from Haifa, Israel. Probably also, I think we can ask this of both of you. In the mid and long term, does it remain appropriate to consider the Middle East in post-Westphalian state, or are we looking at a different view of that, with the exception of Iran, Israel, Turkey, and Egypt? Ehud, will you start, please?
Yes, sure. Thank you. It's a long lecture. I'll give the bottom line. My opinion, limited guarantee. Some of the states of the Middle East, the Arab states of the Middle East, exist now only on the map. There is no state. Nobody can convince me that you still have the state of Lebanon or Syria. I'm willing to argue about Iraq. I would not bet on the stability long-term of some of the other countries, including KSA, Saudi Arabia. Because, again, without going to the lecture, the decline of political Arabism is of such magnitude that it affects everything. And you've reached a point where in tiny Lebanon, people are talking seriously about splitting or switching to a system of a federal system. Same in Syria. It's broken in a way that it cannot be put together. So you want to call it post-Westphalian? By all means. It's just for example, Syria. In Syria, you follow the situation and the developments by towns and tribes. by different militias. The Syrian army is no longer the Syrian army. It's a combination of rival military units. The 4th Division of Assad's brother, Maher, has grown into a monster. And it acts in a way which is opposed to the other divisions of this Syrian army. You can go on and on. And I believe that we are going to see this implosion accelerated. The Arab Spring is not over. Demonstrations, etc. You have it all the time in many places. But the Arab Spring is not a sign, unfortunately, of revival and renaissance. It's the death certificate of political Arabism as envisaged roughly 100 years ago by some Lebanese Christian intellectuals. I'll stop here.
Neo, do you have a perspective on this?
Yeah, I think it is no doubt that in the next decades, the Arab community will face great challenges. At the same time, maybe that is great opportunities. The reason is that there are two important factors will influence the Arab country in the next decade. The first is how the Arab country will govern its people. The second factor is the oil. The importance of oil is declining. The oil price is low. It is very likely it will lower for longer. So without oil, or the importance of oil is declining, will significantly change Arab countries' economic structure and political structure. So the Arab Spring has passed, but the problems which caused the Arab Spring has not been solved. Actually, every problem is getting worse. The political legitimacy, the freedom, justice, dignity problem getting worse. So in the future, how the Arab countries to find its own political solution to govern its people is still a very big challenge. Until now, I don't think they find suitable solutions. For the economic situation, with the low oil price, every Arab country face a huge economic challenge. They have to change their economic structures. That is a very big challenge. So I think in the next decades, we will see a very turbulent period in the Arab community.
Thank you very much. We have a few questions that ask about the Middle East and Xinjiang and the connections there. We have a question from Gudrun Wacker from Berlin. She says that the masks that were supplied to the Arab countries during COVID were mainly made in Xinjiang, which indicates a connection between China's perspective on Islam and the Middle East. Could you elaborate a bit on how you might see a connection there, Professor Neo?
So I'm sorry, I don't know the details. I'm an expert on strategic issues. I can talk the general issues between China and the Middle East. China's global strategy, but I don't know the details about whether masks were made or how the Xinjiang issue connected with the Middle East. I don't know the details. I cannot clarify that.
Okay, actually, we are really coming to a swift close. I want to say we have a brief question from Asif Shuja from Singapore, who says that Professor Neo elaborated on how China is very pleased to have the US manage security and politics in the region of the Middle East. And meanwhile, China can pursue its economic interests, which shows a clear relevance for China, but asks what each of you think might be the benefits to the US to continue this process where US invests in military engagement and security and political relations, and China has economic benefits. Can you each give me one sentence in closing on that subject, starting with Neo and finalizing with Ehud? Thank you.
Okay, for United States, its interest in the Middle East is declining. So that is the reason why United States' strategy is retrenched. But the problem is that if United States leave the Middle East, the situation will get worse. So the choice for United States is not between good and bad. The choice for United States is bad, worse, and worst. So I think United States should choose the bad choice, stay there. That's my answer.
Ehud.
Yes, I think anyway, America is not going to withdraw from the Middle East. They're going to reconfigure the way they stay, and we've discussed it before. And China benefits for the time being. China benefits from the fact that the Fifth Fleet is there, and that the nuclear-powered submarine Georgia has crossed the Straits of Hormuz now into the Persian Gulf, etc. About the Uyghurs, I wanted to say one sentence. Basically, the economic bonds, the economic ties that China has managed to forge with the Arab countries, with Iran, and with Turkey have led to a situation in which the Arab world, I'm meaning the Arab governments, the establishment, are quite silent on whatever is happening in Xinjiang. Even Turkey, that used to host in the past activists from Western China, Erdogan has changed this tack. And I think this is a demonstration of how much political clout China was able to acquire in this region.
Thank you so much. So we have now concluded the sessions for today. I want to thank Dr. Neo, Ehud Yaari, Ron Friedman, our moderator, Hagai Shagrir, Dorian Barak, and Zhao Hai for 2 excellent sessions. At the end of yesterday's discussions, we heard from the US perspective on China, the US-China rivalry, and recommendations for Israel from the top diplomat dealing with the Middle East. Today, we are really privileged to hear the concluding keynote address of this, the 5th annual conference on Israel's China policy, from Ambassador Yue Xiaoyong, the former ambassador of the People's Republic of China to the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, former ambassador to Qatar and to Ireland. Dr. Yue is a special expert of the China Forum of Tsinghua University, a senior research fellow and director for the Center of Global Studies in the National Academy of Development and Strategy at Renmin University. Dr. Yue is also a council member of the Institute of International and Strategic Studies at Peking University. We are deeply grateful to him for taking the time to join us today and honored that he is now going to bring the 2020 conference to a close. Ambassador Yue, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kelly. And also, I'm also very happy to be invited in this renowned platform. Thank you for your very kind words. But I don't think I'm in a position to do a very good summary of the discussion, which is really very enlightening, educational, and very well informed among all these well-established experts. A lot of information for me to digest. Before I do the summary, I noticed that just now, some questions about Xinjiang and Uyghurs, about the masks and the PPE, maybe. I will give a brief answer to that. I should thank for the question asked by someone from Germany. I don't know whether he have been to China or not. Some situation in Xinjiang, I think a lot of it is, I wouldn't say this fake news, but a lot of misinformation going on. And they describe the Xinjiang as a lot of imagination. The fact is, about this PPE, if you look at the map, or you just place an order to buy PPE or mask from China, look at the map, pick up any province. One province have a population with a population of say 80 million, 70 million, bigger than any countries in Europe, bigger than Germany. I mean, for the capability to produce the mask, China can pick up any province to supply high quality PPE, and which is known to all the countries. So to be careful about this news about what is going on in Xinjiang. And actually, if you listen or find information about Xinjiang and Uyghurs and all the other national ethnic groups, they actually enjoyed a quite good growth and improvement of their life. And be careful about those imagined in a narrative from the West, the media, and other places. And if there's time, we can provide more materials about how much improvement and what is the real situation there. Come back to the to my presentation, I would say. I don't know how much time I have, and I think I would briefly talk about three parts: China's foreign policy, the major thinking of China's foreign policy, and our relation with our good friend Israel, plus our relation with the Middle East in general, and Sino-American relations, which is a hot topic too. First of all, about China's foreign policy, I don't want to go to a lot of details, specific points, but I want to give a general picture. Facing all the changes in the global situation, we all know in this year, the COVID-19, the difficult economic recovery, a lot of protectionism and turbulences. China still hold a view that the major trends in this world, it is still that of peace, development, cooperation, which means that we don't think major powers are ready to all-out war and destroy the peace of the world. And we still see that most countries, or those countries who have the influence of their region, of their global situation, their efforts are focusing more on the peace, development, and cooperation, and to improve the life of their people, rather than to ready for war. That is the basic assessment of the global situation of China. And the second basic assessment of the world for China, for the world from China, is most countries, what they are busy every day, spend their time, is how to have a stable situation that they can have a better growth and have a better stable cooperation for their development of the nation, of the region. Thirdly, I think all the countries still are thinking more on the cooperation with the rest of the world instead of how destroy the cooperation. Where is the difference? The difference is maybe different countries have different approach. We still have a world, as you know, there's no single global government. And the governance of the world is different from a nation. This is a basic knowledge of all the international students. But sometimes maybe we tend to forget. And when we think of the governance of the world affairs, some people, some country want to have the dominance by their own. And some other people push for the open of the world, just like the United States after before and after the Second World War, and they get an Atlantic Charter. They want old imperial powers and colonial powers to turn into a more open world. And now, I think, including China, we are advocating for an even more open world, and perhaps on an equal footing, on a flat playground, and to let more people, we have more people in the world now. We have more players in the world now. And what we are facing is, let's find a way to let all the country to play in this world, to interact with each other on a more and reasonable rules, based on what we have achieved and enshrined in the United Nations Charter and many other rules enshrined in international law. That is my first part of my view, and I believe China's view about this situation. As for this negative trend, just now I heard Professor Yari and a lot of other well-respected experts give a lot of very good views and analysis. There are some negative trends we all know too. Unilateralism for one, protectionism for other, and populism in some countries really disturb the situation. And of course, China used the term hegemony. They want a single power to dominate everything. And we have the adjustment of the foreign policy in the United States, which really give a lot of food for thought for a lot of countries, including Europe, including Middle East, and China. American first. This needs time for all other countries to adjust, even need time for America to further adjust, just like we heard from President-elect Biden said he wants to build back better. He believes to build back better. while others maybe think otherwise. So America itself is in the middle of adjustment. For China, I want to emphasize, and I want to use this platform, distinguished, renowned platform, to have the message that China's foreign policy, the guidelines of the foreign policy remains the same. Ever since we launched our reform and opening up. That is, we want to maintain world peace, promote cooperation, and what we said in the term, we want to continue to go for the peaceful development path. In some other seminar and discussion, I said this is China's term, 和平发展道路. Put it in English words is three common words. Maybe we didn't find a Greek word for it, so you know it has a special meaning. So China's peaceful development path means China as a big country or developing country want itself make consciously efforts and try consciously, continuously harder to help to sustain this peaceful situation in the world, to sustain this common development promotion efforts in the world, to realize a better cooperation situation. Just now, some Israeli friends said they are interacting between China and the United States, especially the United States adjustment of the policy. And I think to cut in a little bit here is, if we put China and the US in this point, and we find from America, they said, this is competition. This is another threat. But for China, we say, why not we share the opportunity? Why not we try to find a win-win situation? Why not we find a bigger cake? We made a bigger cake. So, this part I want to conclude is, China, even now, if you look at our president's policy statement and the Chinese government policy statement, and you look at the Chinese companies, what they do, it is very consistent. That is, China is coming for more opportunities and to build a bridge to help the development, to have a peaceful situation for all to enjoy the cooperation. Secondly, I want to say that I agree with many points put forward by both our Chinese expert, and I think some of them I know before. Professor Liu Xinchun, happy to see him again today. Excuse me. I hope I won't take too long. With that global view, I should say my key word today for this conclusion is cautiously optimistic. It is cautiously optimistic for our worldview and our general guideline of the foreign policy. It is also, I want to see a perhaps very optimistic future on our relations with the Middle East in general and with Israel in particular. After decades of development efforts of both China and Israel, and both China and countries in the Middle East, they have laid actually, as it is demonstrated today in the seminar, laid out by both sides a solid foundation for our bilateral relations with deeper mutual understanding, ever-growing cooperation, and deep mutual confidence in our shared future. Of course, some experts mentioned in the technology innovation cooperation, there are some doubts, suspicion and doubts about how to proceed in future. But that is a problem we can try to solve even among our dialogue with the United States and with Israel. Our mutual support and assistance ever since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic is a very good example, and current ongoing cooperation in Belt and Road Initiative in battling the pandemic and for a common economy development are further evidence. We in China also like to continue to develop a strong and fruitful relations with Israel, as well as all the partners and friends in the Middle East region. Both China and Israel, as China and the Middle East ties in general, need also to work together to strengthen, like we speak with our European partners and our Asian partners, to strengthen multilateralism in international arena and regional arena, turning down Cold War mentality, promote peace and common development, and keep opposed to unilateralism. Unity is the key. I mean, unity not only in the narrow sense and the countries only unity with their allies, but a unity to all the countries, those who are willing and ready and have the potential to do the cooperation with you as another country, right? And with respect. China is determined to go on to strengthen our ties with all countries in the Middle East, as we see many presentations made in this platform today, to promote this kind of cooperation. And together, to contribute to tackling challenges facing the global community, climate change, actually a lot of challenges to the Gulf states. As I stayed in that country as ambassador, we talk about the agenda of the new energy and climate change. They really feel there would be some challenge and transformation. And per capita wise, maybe the Gulf states is the highest in the world. I don't want to name the country, but it is on record that the per capita of the carbon dioxide emission would be as much as 60 kilograms, 60,000 kilograms a year, way higher than any country in the world. So they, in addition to the other cooperation, they need international help. Public health, guarding against nuclear proliferation, hunger and poverty lifting, economic recovery and growth pushing, and cybersecurity and so on and so forth. There's a long list. I'm very happy to say that the relations between China and Israel are strong and dynamic. In recent years, as I talk with my colleagues in Beijing, this relations has witnessed a rapid growth and enjoyed a real win-win cooperation with the two countries as comprehensive partners in innovation, great congruity in development ideas, highly mutual complementary industries, and ever-expanding fruitful collaboration. As some of the, I think experts say that even in the innovation, we have the new challenges, but it is the same paradigm with many other countries in the world that in Europe, they're also very dynamic, as I posted in Ireland, for example. They are also very dynamic in the international innovation in technology and some other countries. But the market are in China, or China at least put its weight in this humanity, scientific and technology innovation. It is a huge, huge opportunity, even opportunities for the United States. This is a common effort for all, actually. Especially, we all know, as you develop research and develop R&D, you need an intermediate market, sophisticated market, preliminary market to evolve. Where to find this market? You can find no such market in America, less or more or less different in Europe. But China provides a perfect market for innovation. Maybe the only one if you consider its size and the depth. Why a big company can grow quickly in China? Because we not only aimed at higher point of the science and technology, we have our preliminary market. We have our intermediary market. And we are moving together with Europe and Israel to the higher part of the market. We all know the rising tide lifts all boats. This rising tide is the combination of China, Israel, Middle East, United States, and Europe. During the pandemic, the Chinese and Israel have been working together, we all know, with deep mutual understanding in joining hands to overcome challenges. I really appreciate this effort. I have many Israel friends too. Sometimes it's very moving and touching stories about that, demonstrating the power of unity and cooperation. At the critical moment of China's fight against a pandemic, President Rivlin and the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli friends from all walks of life extended their sympathy and support. China also firmly stands with Israel in the fight. We have held sessions of video conference between Chinese and Israel medical experts and will continue to do so. We are facilitating Israel's procurement and transportation of medical supplies in and from China. You find anything from Xinjiang? Well, even from Xinjiang is a good thing. That means we are all helping Xinjiang. As for that narrative, that's another story. We are facilitating Israel's procurement and transportation of medical supplies in and from China. Cities and business, universities, and ordinary people from China expressing their sympathy and donating PPE to Israel too. Moreover, China's investment and firms with projects in Israel have been steadily resuming their operations, contributing to Israel's efforts in both battling pandemic and sustaining economic recovery. Crisis will never stop, I believe. China and Israel to pursue greater cooperation. The governments and the peoples of the two countries have every will and wisdom to prevail over the disease and reinvigorate the growth. I have no many numbers. I won't go all of them, but the trade in this year, even with so many challenges, is really impressive. This year of 2020, the bilateral trade between China and Israel topped over $6.3 billion, registering an increase of 20% growth, among which Israel's export to China increased by 51% to $2.4 billion. Not long ago, the negotiation teams of our two countries concluded the last round of FTA consultations. And both sides are positive on reaching the agreement at the earlier date. I think this FTA discussion is really very much parallel with our discussion with Europe Union too. It is also making progress. I don't know, there is a little competition here too. Maybe Israel will catch up. By the end of this year, the preparation meeting for the 5th Joint Committee on the Innovation Cooperation will be convened to formulate the blueprint of our future. From what I see and read, it can be well expected that in the years to come, with joint efforts of wise leadership, including the public support from both sides, China-Israel friendship, cooperation, and comprehensive innovation partnership will grow. From our view, it will grow. I noticed some experts now today raise some questions, which is very impressive, and I will also take note. Okay, thank you. I saw you conclude, but I have another part of Sino-American relations. Whether you like to listen, I don't know. Yeah, this relations really, I cut short about the China-Israel relations. And may I say a few words, ladies and gentlemen, may I say a few words about the Sino-American relations? Okay, I noticed that there is a Chinese calligraphy in the chairman's wall. Miss Witty. China-US relations, just a moment. China-US relationship is now indeed in a critical juncture. With new Biden administration to be running the White House, there is certainly new hope that personally I feel a lot of Chinese people are very much guard against that, but I still like to I always like to strike a more optimistic view compared with many of my colleagues. With new Biden's administration to be running the White House, there is certainly new hope that these ties could get onto a more stable and more predictable track. Yet it may also go to some different way, which would be something peoples on either side would like to see. On neither side would like to see. For me, who happens to be the one used to work on this relationship for more than a decade, I want to also strike a fairly optimistic tone, but with many wait and see notes. There have been too many bad things happening in recent years. Many are saying that as long as both sides can really see where their fundamental interests lie, this relationship could see a return, one way or another, away from abnormal. At present, I have not seen the light yet. There is some talk from new administration, such as President-elect Biden said, China is not a threat. Russia is a threat. China is a competitor. What's the difference between the two? We have to see. And also he point climate change, public health, global stability as the field. Both sides can talk and see the cooperation. So there is a different tone there. In his congratulation message to the President-elect George Biden, our President Xi Jinping noted, promoting healthy and stable development of Sino-American relations not only serves the fundamental interests of the people in both countries, but also meets the common expectation of the international community. I hope, our president hopes, that the two sides will uphold the spirit of non-conflict, non-confrontation, mutual respect, and win-win cooperation. Focus on cooperation, manage differences, advance the healthy and stable development of China-US ties, and join hands with other countries, with Israel maybe, and the countries in the Middle East, and the international community to promote the noble cause of world peace and development. This is China's proposal and expectation on China-US relations in the next stage, and hopefully would also become a shared view of the policymakers and the advisors in the US. China is ready to work with China's side, US side, in a direction that serves common interests of our two peoples and the peoples in the world also, and to be conducive for world peace, stability, and common development. And actually, I have some other elaboration of these relations. I want to cut short here with the emphasis that there are some difficulties and challenges between these countries, between China and the US, and there are different so-called strategic assessments from United States upon China. But I think the key is to resume more dialogues between each other, to have better communication, and to have deep understanding and common analysis of this situation. China, of course, will defend our core interests, as many countries do, while we want to have this mutual respect and win-win cooperation with all countries, including in the United States, not only for our two countries, but for the sake of the peace, stability, security, and cooperation in the world. As this going on, I think many of the doubts, or some of the doubts, or some of the questions between China and Israel, especially in this, today we discussed the science and technology field, maybe we'll have a better solution and a prospect. Thank you very much. I take too much time.
Ambassador Yue, thank you for your extremely comprehensive remarks. We very much appreciate your views. Hopefully the optimism of peace, development, and cooperation will be followed by actions that promote peace, development, and cooperation in ways that take into consideration the concerns of the region and the concerns of the major powers. I want to thank you so much for contributing your valuable insights and taking the time to be with us today. And I want to thank everyone in the audience for sticking with us throughout these 2 days of proceedings. Thank you again to Assistant Secretary Shankar for his contribution yesterday, and a very special thanks to our excellent moderators and wonderful guest speakers, both yesterday and today, from the US, Japan, Singapore, China, and Israel. But most of all, I want to thank the really outstanding Signal team for producing this wonderful event that so fittingly commemorated our 10th anniversary. A very special thanks to Evelyn Guesa, our stalwart production manager, and to Tommy Steiner, our policy consultant. Thanks to everyone. Looking forward to seeing you again next year in person. Bye to everybody. Thank you.